One of the most important and often overlooked elements of investing and due diligence is looking at the management team and their ability to push the company in the right direction. Today we're going to talk about some of the key factors you need to take into consideration when looking at a company's management team. How's it going, guys? Ryan here and welcome back to the Stock Due Diligence series, episode 4, where we are covering the management team and the importance of having a strong one. But before we get into that, guys, please remember to give this video a thumbs up if you do enjoy it, and subscribe if you're interested in seeing more stock market, investing, wealth management and cryptocurrency content. I'd also love to know down in the comment section below your thoughts on the management team's importance when considering a stock for investment. But without further ado, guys, please let's get straight into today's video. When looking at a company to invest in, one of the most overlooked factors, in my opinion, is the management team. And in fact, they are one of the most critical elements in the success of any organization. Effectively, they are the team of people who will lead the company to success. You can have an absolutely fantastic company, but have an awful management team, and ultimately that company will fail due to poor decisions being made at the top that steered the company in the wrong direction. And effectively, if you have a really good management team, they can take organizations down from the dumps to fantastic organizations, completely turn them around, turn them from, companies making big losses into companies making big profits. So do not underestimate the value of the management team that is leading the organization. So let's get into some of the key factors that you need to consider when you're looking at the management team for an investment. Now, there are 6 key factors that I want you to consider when you're looking at the management team, but bear in mind these are quite subjective and will vary significantly from company to company. You'll have certain situations where things will be good and certain situations where things will be bad, but it really comes down to the circumstance of the company and the type of company you're investing in. So the first one is the number of shares held by the management team or the directors of the organization. Now, typically you want to be looking for organizations where those directors or those management executives hold lots of shares or a large portion. That means you'll have a strong influence and a strong stability when it comes to the share price. Now, I'll get more into detail in that later, but we talk about things like buying of shares, selling of shares, the amount of shares held, that sort of thing will really come into consideration here, and is probably one of the most obvious factors that you can look at immediately to see the strength of the management team with regards to the financial interest in the shares. The second factor I want you to consider is the qualifications, and this really comes down to the technical capabilities of these individuals leading the company. For instance, you wouldn't want an IT guy leading a mining company. You'd effectively want someone who's been in the mining game for a long time and has a good understanding of mining, whether that be, a geologist, or it might be an engineer, for instance. These are the sort of people that would typically fit that sort of role. So make sure you look at the qualifications. The third point that I want you to consider is prior experience. Is the people leading the company having huge amounts of experience, little amounts of experience, or I suppose mid-ground amounts of experience? Have they been in this field before, or have they led companies in other fields? These are certain factors you'll want to consider, and we'll get a bit more into that later on. The fourth factor to consider is the reputation of the individuals. And if you've spent a bit of time on social media, you can see how this plays a really big role. If you have a reputation which is tarnished, then effectively you are going to push people away, and your bad name brings down the reputation of the company. So this is actually quite something that is critical to the success, initially at least, of an organization, as it's what brings in a lot of new investors. The fifth point I want you to consider is, are the management team the original team, the founders, or are they a new team that have been brought in after a big change or a big shift in direction, for instance? These will really affect the driving factors and potentially the factors that are taken into consideration when we're looking at making a company more profitable or turning it around, when it is down in the dumps and we want to turn it into a profitable company by, bringing new people in, new experience, new points of view, that sort of thing. The sixth point I want you to consider is interviews. And when I talk about interviews, I mean the interviewability of the individuals. More often than not, you'll see investor presentations. And when you look at those, the person presenting is typically the managing director. How do they present? Do they understand obviously what they're talking about? Are they able to answer questions? Are they able to clearly articulate what the company's doing? These are really important factors, and that is what investors will see and will be looking at prior to investing in an organization. So let's dive a little deeper into these key points. The first key aspect we will focus on is the shares held by the directors of the organization. And the reason this is so important is because that means that these directors will have some sort of a financial stake and a financial gain in the success of the organization beyond their typical day-to-day salary. So as a result, they've also got that as a driving factor to be successful from a more personal point of view. When we're looking at the number of shares held on an overall basis, you want to look for companies which have a strong top 20 holding, and hopefully a very large portion of that is actually the executives. So typically if you're looking at, 20 to 50% held by management, that is a good thing, or probably more to the area of 20 to 50% held by the top 20, and then a very large portion of that is held by the management team. That shows that effectively almost half the shares, or a very large proportion of the shares, are held by the directors, the people in charge, and typically you won't see much selling going on, which means it's easier for the share price to go up in value if demand increases. So keep that in the back of your mind. The next thing you want to look at is, are the directors buying or selling shares? And this is very important because we see a number of key factors being taken into consideration here. If directors are buying shares, they are putting money out of their own pocket into the organization. And that means they literally have a personal financial interest in the organization. And this is not shares, for instance, that have been given to them by the organization. This is shares they've purchased on their own accord because they genuinely believe in the organization's success. So that is a very, very strong factor to consider when looking at the company's management team. If they're buying shares, that's great. The opposite of that is, are they selling shares? And typically what I've seen is when a director sells shares, this share price is going to absolutely take a beating because it puts panic into its holders. Your holders obviously want to see a strong holding. And if you've got the people sitting at the top selling their shares, that sows the seeds of doubt, and that results in shareholders selling their own shares as well. So make sure you're not investing in a company where you can see clearly that the management team is dumping their shares, because that is not good news for anyone and will result purely just on the face of it in a sell down of the share price because people don't have confidence. So make sure you look at the number of shares held, and this is one of the easiest things that you can do, and everything's public. So you have separate announcements, separate appendix that are released basically to the market showing when the directors are changing their holdings, as they're typically a substantial interest. Next, take a look at the qualifications of the management team, and this is actually something which can be quite subjective because it doesn't necessarily mean someone is incompetent if they don't have the highest level of qualification, for instance, but it tends to lead you in the right direction. As I mentioned previously, you wouldn't want an IT guru being the person who's leading a mining organization. You'd obviously rather someone who has been in the mining game and understands how that all works, whether it be a geologist, where it be a mine manager, where it be, an engineer, someone who understands the more intricacies and the special aspects that are involved with that certain industry. So if you can look for managers which have qualifications that are relevant to what they're doing, that is a big tick of approval. Also, it's worth looking at things like MBAs, as it shows a bit high level of leadership potential in these sort of aspects. Obviously, degrees and qualifications and that sort of thing aren't going to be the be all and end all, but they are an important consideration to make when looking at the organization. In fact, one key thing you can look at is where did they get their qualification from? Did they get it from a very important university, for instance, or did they get it from just your random university? That might show a high level of education or not, or even their ability to get into those universities shows you that they are more than competent in their fields. The third point to consider is the prior experience of the management team and directors. And prior experience really comes down to what are the past projects or the past organizations that these individuals have worked for. So for instance, let's go back to mining. If you've got an exploration company and they bring on a new director or managing director rather, in order to bring the company into production, have they been able to successfully do that previously, or is this their first time? Obviously, with experience, you've gone through the hard yards previously, understand how things work a little bit more better than people who have not done it before. That is just a simple fact. Doesn't mean someone's not competent. Once again, if they haven't done it before, it just means that the person who has had exposure and more experience, and more importantly, successful experience, is going to be significantly more aware of what to expect in the growth of an organization. And often you'll see that organizations bring in different managers for different time frames at different points in the company's life cycle. Obviously, you're going to be seeing a lot more experienced directors in your blue chip organizations, whereas you might tend to see some more junior people in a smaller organization. When you typically get those really successful people going out and building their own organizations effectively, that is quite a good sign, especially if they're banding together. So if you've got a lot of managers which have a lot of successful project delivery and they've worked together before, for instance, that can create a really good team dynamic and can be a great indicator for the potential success of the organization if they've all delivered previous projects successfully and together. Consideration number 4, reputation. And this really comes down to the literal reputation of the individuals from a character point of view. If you've been on social media, you would have seen, if you've been around long enough and looked at enough companies, certain names keep popping up and they'll either have good connotations or they'll have bad connotations. And it might not even be anything to do with their ability to perform. It just comes down to their reputation based on their character as an individual. But this can make or break a decision for an individual to go, yes, I'm investing, or no, I'm not investing. If you have someone who has consistently pissed off investors in other organizations, then typically you're not going to get such a warm reception when they're leading the organization you're going to be looking at investing in. So obviously that is going to push away people. Whereas if you've got someone with a fantastic reputation, they've been able to deliver lots of projects, they've always made shareholders happy, that sort of thing, typically they'll shift from a company and they'll also bring shareholders with them because they know that that individual is going to potentially turn a company around, or if it's a new company, it's going to be potentially very successful because they can perform and they've got a reputation which indicates that. The next factor I want you to consider is the management team the originals? Are they old or are they new? And this is obviously once again something that's quite subjective, but once again can actually affect the organization overall. If you've got someone who's been there from the start as the founder, they obviously have a passion for what they're doing and are going to be emotionally invested in the organization, as opposed to bringing someone in who hasn't been that person who's created the company but now they're running it. They won't have the same passion and emotional investment. A perfect example of this is Elon Musk. You can clearly tell he's very passionate about all his organizations, and he pulls insane 18-hour days, 7 days a week, and works so hard. You wouldn't typically get that from your standard CEO. They'll do probably more hours than your average 9-to-5 individual, but they wouldn't be pulling crazy hours like that. And that purely comes down to them not being passionate about what they're investing in. And why would they be? They're purely getting paid for their time at the company, as opposed to it being something they've created and they genuinely want to see it grow. Obviously, you're going to get CEOs, MDs, senior managers who want the company to be successful because the company's success equals their success, but do they have the same drive? Another example, and this is something that is more the opposite. If a company's failing, have they brought in new management, or is it still the old management? Maybe if it is the original management and they're failing, it's time for a shake-up and we need new managers in there in order to turn the organization around. Fresh faces, fresh ideas, fresh expertise can really affect the direction of the company. So if they bring in new directors, for instance, or new experts, is the company going to turn around? Potentially. Plus, once again, we go back to that example of a mining exploration company, getting in new managers for the time frame and for the period of expansion of that organization. People who are exploring versus people who are building a mine versus people who are actually producing are very different skill sets, and people are strong in certain areas but not in other areas. For instance, you may want an MD who is fantastic at finding these deposits and then building them into a operating mine, but they may not have the expertise in order to produce and keep that company running as a producing organization. Rather, what they do is they come in, they're good, they build the organization up to a point of cash flow, and then they leave. Certain people are good at that. So keep these things in the back of your mind when you're looking at the age, I suppose you'd call it, whether they're new, whether they're old, whether they've been around for a long time, whether they're the originals of the management team. The final factor I want you to consider is how interviewable, and I think that's my own word I made up, is the MD or the leaders of the organization. One of the key things that investors will go focus on and go look at is the company interviews and presentations and all these sort of things. How does the managing director, for instance, present? Does he clearly show he understands the organization, the strategic direction, the more technical aspects, or is it a bit wishy-washy and more of a salesman technique? These are factors alone that will influence the direction of the stock price. You could have someone who delivers an absolutely fantastic spiel on an organization and clearly knows what he's talking about, able to answer questions, is very public and the face of the organization, and that alone will result in investors being enticed to buy the stock, as opposed to having an MD that doesn't do interviews, that doesn't do company presentations, does no marketing. As a result, the price is going to be stagnant and not much is going to occur. These are really the subjective and the more interesting factors, in my opinion, to take into consideration when you are investing in a company. Because for myself, I'd much rather have an MD at the face of an organization explaining it, telling shareholders the direction, keeping them up to date, as opposed to an MD which you never hear from. And at the end of the day, I would never invest in an organization where the MD doesn't talk to shareholders or address or interview at all any of the whether it be issues or even the good aspects that are coming out of the company. So make sure you look at the interviewability of the MD and the management team as a whole. I'd love to know your thoughts down in the comments section below on the importance of the management team and some other key aspects you take into consideration when you're investing in a company and looking at the management team specifically. If you did enjoy today's video, please remember to give it a thumbs up. It helps me out so much with the YouTube algorithm, and subscribe for more investing, stock market, wealth management and cryptocurrency content. And without further ado guys, I hope you have an awesome day. I'll see you next time. Cheers.